Well, welcome to the Empowered to Connect podcast, where we come together to discuss a healing-centered approach to engagement and well-being for ourselves, our families, and our communities. I'm JD Wilson, and I'm your host. And today on the show, we continue season 2 with Dr. Nicole West. Dr. West is a therapist at the Memphis Family Connection Center in Memphis, Tennessee, and she does a variety of things there, including but not limited to play therapy and pretty extensive research. And one of the things that we had her talk with us today about, among a few other things, was just the importance of play and the idea of a lot of times parents don't understand the importance of or the necessity of or what's actually happening in the brain of a child when we are playing with them. And so she talks about how to engage your kids in play, different things to be watching out for, different tips and practices to incorporate within your own child. So it's a fascinating episode to learn more of kind of the brain science and what's happening behind the scenes with our kids when we play with them. But a very important episode for all of us, especially as we are, again, kind of in this beginning school season and looking for ways to connect with our kids to maintain that relationship. This is a great episode to check out. So please enjoy with us now, Dr. Nicole West. All right, well, as we mentioned earlier today, we are here today with Dr. Nicole West, and Dr. West does a bunch of things here for the Memphis Family Connection Center. And we're going to talk to her today a little about all of those things. And so, Nicole, thank you for being here, and thanks for agreeing to jump in with us. Why don't we kind of start off with just you sharing your background and how you got into the work that you're in now?
Sure. So I actually majored in psychology in undergrad and got really interested in just how the brain works and what makes people tick. And so I decided to go to grad school and get my master's in clinical counseling psychology because I wanted to work really closely with families and at the time, more specifically with kids. So I think, in grad school, I did an internship at a juvenile justice center where I got to meet with families and work with kiddos, just teaching them some coping skills and strategies just to use in everyday life. And after that, I've done everything from residential counseling to working in schools to working with families in their home. And then we moved to Memphis, and I started my PhD program in counseling and kind of decided that I wanted to still work with kids, but also wanted to work with adults. So I have a really great clientele base that spans from 4 years old all the way to, adults,
right.
Which is really nice because it does give me that break in... adults have really heavy stuff most of the time. And
right.
So it's nice to have some kids mixed in there that I get to play with and just have
right.
fun. And so that's how I ended up here doing play therapy. So
awesome. Okay, so I'm interested to go back a little bit in the story. You talked about working in a juvenile justice center. So during your time there, are there, and this might have to end up being a whole separate series of podcasts probably, but were there a few takeaways from your time there and I really enjoyed seeing this and think in the future, if we could integrate these types of things into juvenile justice, that this might be, a game changer for them.
Yeah, I think one of the really big things that's missing in the juvenile justice system and even the, adult prison system is one, the asking that question of what happened to people to bring them there, and then kind of addressing that because it's all trauma stuff. And we kind of skip over that and just kind of, for lack of a better phrase, we just lock people up and expect them to be better when they get out.
Right.
And typically people go, the recidivism rate is high because we're not addressing whatever the issue was that initially brought them there.
Yeah.
So that was one of my takeaways, just in terms of providing people with a mental health outlet, someone to talk to, someone to, verbally express all of their emotions. So missing the whole mental health piece, I think, in the juvenile justice world and missing the trauma piece, just helping people address the scary things that have happened in their life that led to whatever behaviors that, put them into the juvenile justice or the adult prison system. So if we could incorporate more of that, I think we would actually do much better at rehabilitating people, which is supposed to be the goal.
Right.
But if we're missing those really key pieces, then, we're not really doing people justice, like giving them that piece. So
that's good. Yeah, I think we will have to have a whole separate episode to talk about that. I have so many questions. So we'll stay more on track here today. So one of the things that I was interested in, that we were interested in talking to you about, was play therapy, because, and I told you this before we recorded, I think the more cynical side of me, years ago when I heard about play therapy for the first time, I kind of rolled my eyes and I was like, oh, come on. Like, this is like a money-making scheme from counselors. Like, play therapy. Like, I play with my kids. That's their therapy, So I just for clarity, I have changed my tune on that. I understand it now,
Yeah.
So why don't we kind of walk through that, like the foundation of what play therapy is and why it's important?
So you are really not very different from most parents who are not counselors and who haven't learned about play therapy. I think if I didn't sit through a certification class, I'd be thinking the same thing. Why am I going to pay someone to play with my kid? Like, I can do that at home for free. So most parents feel that way. I think in our minds, we think therapy and we think about talking. And so when a therapist recommends playing, parents are like, my kid does that at home. That's not something I need to, spend time getting to the appointment, sitting in the waiting room.
Right.
And then, parents just sometimes are like, that's going to be a waste. But if you are good at explaining what play therapy is and how it can help children alleviate all kinds of, behavioral symptoms and mental health symptoms, then parents usually are like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. That seems like something worth paying for.
Right.
So basically, play therapy is a treatment for children that really helps them express their emotions. Anything internally that's going on, any kind of internal conflict, whether that is anxiety or depression. Children usually don't have the words. They don't have the verbal skills to say, I'm sad and this is why. Sometimes even adults, we're sad and sometimes we don't know why.
Yes. Yeah.
So a 5-year-old, they really can't verbalize why. But it helps them to kind of develop communication skills, and it's their natural way of being. Playing is just natural for kids, like talking is natural for adults. Yeah. And so when kids go into the playroom, they are able to work some of those things out through their play. So we've all probably seen kids play and their imagination is, amazing. And so if they're playing with two dolls, and they are trying to work out some internal conflict, they will do that with those two dolls. They might have a conversation about some issue they're having on the playground or some issue that they're having with their brother and sister. And they're kind of working it out as they play, which is really, really cool to watch. And kids, they don't know they're working through their inner stuff. They think they're just playing. Yeah. And so it really just helps kids to kind of express that stuff that's going on internally that they don't have the words for.
And I would imagine kids who experience trauma or loss early on, like that's probably a big target population of play therapy, right? Like it's an early entry into those conversations.
Yeah. So play therapy is really good to address trauma because, again, kids can kind of play out what they've seen, what they've heard, things that might be scary or things they don't have words for. They can play all of that stuff out. It's also really good for kids with ADHD, kids with anxiety, kids with depression, and kids that are going through a divorce, all kinds of life difficulties that kids might experience are really good for play therapy because kids just get to, work it out through the natural way that they just that they are. So it's really cool to watch, and they're just playing, and so they're having fun.
I love that. So let's kind of go to the nerd side of things for a second and talk about what is actually happening. Like, what are the connections that are happening that allow that to be an effective form of therapy? Like, are there different things happening in the brain, body, together, all that. Can you kind of walk us through that?
Yes. So basically, we have two different sides of our brain, the left side of our brain and then the right side of our brain. And the left side of our brain, it is that kind of like conscious, rigid, verbal side of our brain. And right, the left side is. And the right side is more of where our inner emotions are held. And so play therapy basically helps the youth to kind of integrate both sides and kind of make sense of situations because they're using that verbal, that like rigid thinking side of their brain, but also incorporating the emotional side of the brain. And when you kind of put those two things together, you have a better way of, I guess, managing or understanding
Yeah.
the things that you're experiencing. And it's also happening within the safety of a relationship with the therapist. So I'm not a neuroscientist by any means. I took a cognitive neuroscience class in undergrad and I got a C and I just squeaked by. So I really cannot tell you like the exact neuroanatomy of it all, but I know that, it helps kids to kind of integrate both sides of their brain, which always makes things more easy to understand.
Right.
To process.
Okay, so I'm thinking about a lot of parents who are going to be listening to this, and as we're recording this, summer is sort of in full swing. When this airs, summer will be winding down. We're thinking about school starting again. At this particular point in history, we're coming out of this pandemic, and either you've had a ton of time with your kids at home, and they're all ready to explode or get back, have some space, whatever. Yeah. Or you've got kids who are now starting to maybe express a little bit of dread about going back or nervousness or uneasiness. So let's talk more about the kind of the parenting side of this. So as we're thinking about heading back into school and that sort of season, are there some things that parents can be thinking about, like how to utilize these last couple of weeks of summer from a play perspective? And what are some ways that parents can kind of use thoughtful play at home to help their kids?
So I have a 6-year-old, and his favorite thing to do besides eating ice cream is to play. And so because we have spent the last year and a half, I think, together, I've had to be creative with ways to have fun, and ways to kind of change it up. And so I try to incorporate some time, like in the morning, sometime in the evening, just for us to kind of play and be together. There's such a special kind of attachment that happens when you play with your kids. That I don't think you can form in other ways. I mean, you can attach with your kids in various ways, but play is everything to kids, and to have their parents kind of engaging with them as they do that just is something special for kids. So, maybe just kind of taking out some time, and if you even have to schedule it, which I typically do, and my kid never forgets to remind me if I'm off the schedule by 5 minutes when it's time to play.
Right.
But sometimes we have such chaotic lives that we do have to kind of take the time to schedule something like playing with our kids, because it is so important to them. And I find that, when I go into it, I'm like, this is more for him to have fun. And, sometimes I'm kind of dreading it, but I know that it's a special time. And so I do it.
Right.
But I actually enjoy it too.
Yeah.
It's really, it's just a pleasurable experience to have with him and seeing him have fun. He's seeing me have fun, and we're having fun together. And it just, it helps the bond, I guess, with your kids. And so parents think that play is just for kids, but it's really for us too.
Yeah.
I don't know when we lose that as adults. We lose the ability to play. We lose the I don't know. We almost think it's not for us anymore.
Right.
But it should be for us, whether we have kids or not. Play is just relaxing and calming, and it's one of those things that feels, great. And so if we can kind of, I don't know, maybe even lessen our expectations about being an adult.
Yeah.
And kind of
yeah.
be more kid-like, I think we would all just be less stressed.
And you find that like one of the things that that helps when you're trying to engage with your kid in play is allowing like child-led play. Like, is that as important, or do you feel like it's important for parents to stay in control of that? Like, how is that?
Yeah. So that's a great question, because in play therapy, there's the non-directive play and then there's the directive play. And the directive play is actually giving the kid a prompt and having them, do something playful.
Yeah.
And then the non-directive play is more child-led. So they get to decide what happens. The benefit of the non-directive play, where the child gets to decide, is it gives them some sense of control. And so part of trauma and part of anxiety is feeling out of control. And so as much as we can give choice, it brings back that feeling of control, which in turn brings back the feeling of safety. So when a child goes into the playroom, I always start with, this is your room. You get to play with all of these toys. These are your toys. You have control over this whole entire room for, the 50, 60 minutes that we're in there.
Yeah.
And I tell them also, there's really no rules. You don't have to play with anything. You can play. You can play as rough as you want. The only rule is that we just want to keep each other safe.
Yeah.
Other than that, there's no rules. And where else do kids get to do whatever they want with no rules?
Never. Right. Movies only.
Yeah, exactly. So that makes them really, really happy that they get to decide what goes on in that room. And it gives them a sense of control as well. So there's pros and cons to, child-directed play and then more directive. But that non-directive play just gives kids back that control and that feeling of safety. I know what the rules are. I know what to expect. I know all of this stuff is mine until it's time to go.
Yeah.
And that's it's a cool feeling for kids to have, because, some kids don't get that control or that feeling of safety anywhere else.
Well, I would imagine, and this has been somewhat the case in our own house. So we've got a toddler, and toddlers always want to rule the world, right? And
Yes.
so, one of the counterintuitive things about our like ETC parenting curriculum is talking about being able to give appropriate levels of control to your kids. And we talked about that a few weeks ago on the podcast. And so one of the little adventures for us has been like kind of giving the toddler more and more options and choices. And what we're finding now is like that leading to a healthier decision-making paradigm for her. And so, so I think that is like an incredible, there's all these things that are happening developmentally below the surface that we never know about. And that, it's cool that we were wired in a way that play can bring that out. It can be fun and also developmental for us and for adults too, right?
Yeah.
Like, so I'm wondering, in thinking about some of the more like, obviously we can read stories of like play therapy, like hallmark cases of like really dramatic change that happened or whatever. But just thinking for, again, mom and dad who are at home and might be noticing their kiddo struggling in a particular way. Are there some different like recommendations you might have? So like a kid struggling with anxiety or with like some grief or sadness, and like here's some games or some like scenarios that might be great for mom and dad to play along with them.
So there are a ton of books, a ton of YouTube videos, a ton of games that address all kinds of mental health symptoms. So I think for anxiety specifically, I use a lot of YouTube videos, and there's great channels like Spark Kids. I'm blanking on one of them now. But there's a ton of mindfulness videos that are fun for kids to watch, and they're really educational in terms of helping them understand how to be grounded and how to be in the moment. And when we're in the moment, it almost prevents our mind from doing that spiral thing that anxiety tends to, make us do. So if they can learn how to ground themselves, and that just is basically keeping your mind and your body in the room, in the moment. That is helpful with decreasing symptoms of anxiety. And if they can do it in the room with you and they practice it, that means that they can eventually start to generalize it to other situations, school, family events, parties where they might have anxiety, all kinds of, they can generalize it to all different settings. I think for kids with anger management challenges, there's a couple games that I can, off the top of my head, that you can play. One of them is Don't Spill the Beans, and the other one is the Pop the Pig's Belly game. I can't remember the name of it.
We'll figure it out. We'll put it in the show notes there. Yeah.
Yeah. But those are really good for, helping kids to understand, like, for the Don't Spill the Beans one, for example, it's a game that each player has the same number of beans, and they take turns kind of putting the beans on this little pot. And so what you can do to make it therapeutic or to make it educational for, like, learning coping skills is to talk about something that bothers you, something that makes you mad. And then as you pile on the beans, the pot eventually turns over and spills all of them. So you can talk about that in the manner of, these are the things that make me upset or angry, or even fearful. And you can help the child understand that the more things you pile on there without some coping skills, the more likely you are to kind of spill over and, explode, essentially. And so that's a good one to kind of help illustrate, even with, like, stress. Like, the more we put on ourselves, the more beans we pile on top of the pot, the more likely we are that we're going to have some sort of, blow up or eruption, like a volcano, is another visual that I like to use with kids. And then that Pop the Belly game, you're feeding this little pig these hamburgers, and his stomach gets bigger and bigger and bigger until he eventually, like, pops the button on his little his little shirt. And so you can use that again to kind of illustrate, like, you might have school stress, you might have, you might be being bullied in school, and then you have homework stress when you come home, and maybe your parents are going through a divorce, and there's all these things that kind of pile up. And as you're feeding the pig the hamburger, his stomach gets bigger and bigger until it kind of explodes and pops the button. So those are two really great games that will help you teach kids that we need to develop coping skills and that we need to use them. And that can be for anger, that can be for stress, that can even be for anxiety. And so those are two really, practical things. And I think they're relatively inexpensive. You can find them at, like, Target and Walmart. But those are just good family games to kind of teach some of those reasons for coping skills for parents.
Oh, that's great. Well, okay, as we start to get kind of toward the end here and close out. So I'm thinking about all the families who are bigger families, and you've got wide age ranges, and some of our kids love playing these games together. Some of them cannot handle certain elements of the different games. So I am sure that there are psychological things happening in that setting that parents and caregivers can kind of watch and kind of manage in a way that can be helpful developmentally for the kids. But I don't have any idea of what those things are. So for those of us who have, and I would never use a personal example, right? Like, my kids play together perfectly all the time. But for those people who do have kids that fight when they play games, are there ways that we can be mindful of kind of even using those game experiences in general to help teach, as we're playing?
Yeah, I think everything can be used as a teachable moment with kids, and even with ourselves. Like, if I happen to, if my son happens to see me flip my lid for some reason, I don't know, we're in traffic or something, I try to use that as a teachable moment and say, I wonder how I could have handled that differently. And he helps me to kind of brainstorm ideas. Maybe you could take some deep breaths, because he's heard me tell him that a million times. Or maybe you can ask for a timeout, which, when you're driving, obviously, can't do. But just the fact that he's giving me those suggestions is great, because I've given him those suggestions when he starts to get angry. So the more that he sees me do it, I think the more he will do it. And he will even catch me when I don't do it and remind me, like, Mom, you always tell me to do X, Y, and Z. But I think parents can watch out for, so you all know your children best, and you kind of know when they might be getting to the point where they're going to explode. If we can catch them before that and kind of help them insert a skill in that moment, and if that prevents them from blowing up, then that's great. But we have to teach the kids the skill in order for them to use it, in order for it to actually be reinforced. It's kind of like when kids get suspended over and over, we expect them to be just magically be different when they come back to school.
Right.
But we haven't taught them the skill that they needed, which got them suspended in the first place. Yeah. So they come back and they're like, all right, I've been out of school for 3 days, but I might get into a fight again because I don't have the skill that I need. So parents, if you just kind of watch out for the temperature in your child, if you see them getting, taking really short, fast breaths, or they're getting red, or they're making a fist in their hand, like, you kind of know what your children's patterns are when they're upset. And if you can catch them in that moment and maybe suggest something, maybe let's go take a 5-minute walk, let's go sit in the sun, let's go swing, anything that uses the left and right brain back and forth, like walking, running, anything that's active, climbing a tree, any of those kinds of things. Just get the kid away from the situation, take them outside. That usually helps to calm our limbic system, which is where we hold all of our emotions. So anything you can do to get them outside, get them active, getting that energy out would be really great in the moment.
Awesome. Dr. West, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it so much. And we'll have to come back on and talk, juvenile justice system sometime soon.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, as we said, just some really practical, helpful stuff from Dr. West, and a great look behind the scenes at what's happening in our kids' brain development during play. And so thank you to her, again, so much for joining us today. Last week, we had Dr. Mona de la Hook, and one of the things that we did afterward was issued a challenge. And we issued a challenge that if you would repost something you learned from Mona's episode, as well as tagging ETC in the process, that you would be entered for a little giveaway. And so we're going to reveal the winners of those giveaways this week. We're going to pre-order Mona's new book for 5 of you who did that. And so stay tuned to ETC social media this week for the unveiling of that. We are super excited about that. And stay tuned for an exciting series that we are putting together now that's just going to be a deeper look behind certain behaviors that perplex us as parents. And so all throughout this season, interspersed with other professional interviews, the ETC team is going to be joining up together to talk about different behaviors that perplex us or that are very difficult initially to deal with, and just ways for us to approach that, things for us to remember, all of that. So it's going to be great. You're not going to want to miss that. And stay tuned this coming week for a deeper look at adult attachment. It's going to be something that is very informative, eye-opening, convicting, all of those things, and we can't wait to bring it to you. And so for Mo Ottinger, for Tana Ottinger, for Kyle Wright, who edits and engineers all of our audio, and Tad Jewett, who created all the music behind the ETC podcast, I'm JD Wilson, and we will see you next week on the Empowered to Connect podcast.